"The biggest mistake of my life was marrying you." Rachel said it without hesitation, without anger, without even looking up from the stack of papers in front of her. Somehow that made it worse. There are words you expect to hear during a divorce. Words like disagreement, separation, maybe even regret. But not that. Not after 20 years. Not after everything we had built together. The conference room suddenly felt smaller. The polished oak table reflected the white lights above us. A wall clock ticked quietly in the corner. My attorney sat beside me with his hands folded. Rachel's attorney adjusted his glasses and pretended not to react. But everyone in that room heard it. Everyone. Rachel finally looked up and crossed her arms. Her expression was calm, confident, like someone who had already won. Maybe she thought the words would break me. Maybe she thought I would argue, raise my voice, defend myself. But I didn't. I simply looked at her and nodded once. Not because I agreed. Because in that moment, I realized something important. The woman sitting across from me wasn't the woman I married. The Rachel I fell in love with 22 years earlier would never have said something like that. She would have laughed at the idea. Back then, we were just two broke kids sharing a one-bedroom apartment outside Dallas. We counted every dollar, split fast food meals, sat on folding chairs because we couldn't afford furniture. She used to squeeze my hand and tell me that as long as we were together, we would figure everything else out. I believed her. For a long time, I think she believed it too. But people change. Success changes people faster, especially when they start believing they earned it alone. Rachel leaned back in her chair and gave a small smile. Not a happy smile, a victorious one. The kind people wear when they think the finish line is already behind them. She glanced toward her attorney, then toward the thick folder resting on the table. I knew exactly what she was thinking. The house, the investment accounts, the company shares, the retirement funds. 20 years of accumulated assets spread across hundreds of pages. To Rachel, it probably looked like a menu. To me, it looked like a life. Outside the conference room window, downtown Dallas shimmered beneath a bright Texas afternoon. Cars crawled through traffic 16 floors below. The city kept moving, unaware that my marriage was ending in a room lined with glass and expensive artwork. Funny thing about endings. Most people think they arrive like storms. Loud, dramatic, impossible to miss. The truth is they arrive quietly. One sentence, one signature, one moment when you realize the person sitting across from you stopped seeing you as a partner a long time ago. Rachel gathered her papers and looked directly at me again. "After today," she said, "we can finally move on." Her voice carried certainty, confidence, relief. I simply folded my hands and looked back at her. Because what Rachel didn't know was that this meeting wasn't the ending of my story. It was the beginning of hers. And less than 5 minutes later, the smile on her face would disappear completely. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Rachel sat comfortably in her chair, tapping a manicured finger against the folder in front of her, as if the outcome had already been decided. Her attorney looked relaxed too. That alone told me a lot. They believed the numbers were on their side. They believed the assets were simple. They believed they understood exactly what belonged to me and exactly how much of it Rachel would walk away with. Across the table, my attorney, Michael Harrison, remained perfectly still. No dramatic gestures, no interruptions, just patience. I had hired him because he understood something most people did not. In situations like this, emotions make noise, but paperwork decides outcomes. Rachel cleared her throat and glanced toward the financial summary lying open beside her. I could see highlighted sections from where I sat. The house in Highland Park, the brokerage accounts, the company valuation, retirement investments. Years of work reduced to columns and percentages. She seemed almost eager to move forward, almost eager to start dividing a future she believed was already hers. Michael adjusted a single page in front of him. The motion was small, but I knew what it meant. We were approaching the moment. Rachel did not notice. Neither did her attorney. They were too busy looking at the scoreboard. The funny thing about scoreboards is that they only matter if you understand the rules of the game. Outside the windows, the Texas sun reflected off neighboring skyscrapers. Bright streaks of light slid across the conference room glass. The city looked prosperous and permanent. 20 years earlier, Rachel and I had stood on a downtown sidewalk only a few blocks away, sharing a $5 lunch because that was all we could afford. Back then, neither of us cared about ownership structures or investment accounts. We cared about paying rent on time. Somewhere along the way, that changed. Somewhere along the way, success stopped being something we built together and became something she measured. The change had been gradual. So gradual I almost missed it. Questions that once sounded curious started sounding calculated. Conversations about work turned into conversations about value. What was the company worth now? How much equity had accumulated? How much were the investments earning? At first, I answered everything openly. Marriage is built on trust. At least that is what I believed. Looking back, I realized trust and transparency are not always the same thing. Rachel leaned forward. "Can we move this along?" she asked. Her voice carried the confidence of someone waiting to collect a prize. Michael offered a polite smile. "Of course," he said. He opened a thin folder that looked surprisingly ordinary. No thick binders. No dramatic stacks of evidence. Just a few pages. Rachel barely looked at it. That was her mistake. She thought the important documents were already sitting in front of her. She thought the story had already been written. But stories have a way of changing when people ignore the pages they have never read. Michael glanced at me briefly. I nodded once. The room remained quiet. The clock continued ticking. Rachel sat back in her chair, completely unaware that the next few minutes were about to rewrite everything she thought she knew about our marriage, our assets, and the man sitting across from her. Michael did not speak immediately. He simply organized the papers in front of him while Rachel watched with growing impatience. To her, every second probably felt unnecessary. She wanted signatures, numbers, finality. What she did not understand was that the story she had built in her head depended on assumptions. And assumptions are dangerous things. They feel like facts right up until the moment reality arrives. I sat quietly and looked through the glass wall beside me. The reflection staring back looked older than I remembered. 46 years old. More gray around the temples than there used to be. A few more lines around the eyes. 20 years of building a company will do that to a man. Most people who met me today assumed I had always been successful. They saw the office buildings, the trucks, the contracts, the investment accounts. They never saw the years before any of that existed. They never saw the warehouse with the leaking roof. The borrowed pickup truck with 200,000 miles on it. The winters when I slept 4 hours a night because payroll came before sleep. Rachel had seen those years. She was there when the company was nothing more than an idea scribbled onto legal pads spread across our kitchen table. We were both working then. Both struggling. Both dreaming. Every Friday night we would sit together and talk about what life might look like if the business ever worked. Not if we became rich. Just if we became stable. Back then, stability felt like success. The first contract changed everything. Then another. Then 5 more. What started as a small logistics operation slowly expanded across Texas. Distribution centers. Freight partnerships. Regional contracts. Each year the company grew a little larger. Each year life became a little easier. At least that is how it looked from the outside. The truth is growth creates distance when people stop growing in the same direction. Somewhere along the way, Rachel stopped asking about my days and started asking about valuations. The conversations changed. At first, it seemed harmless. She wanted to understand the business better. That was what she said. But the questions became increasingly specific. How much was the company worth now? How much equity had accumulated? What percentage of growth occurred year over year? I answered everything honestly because I trusted her. Looking back, I realized trust made me transparent, but experience made me cautious. There were decisions I never discussed at the dinner table. Not because I was hiding anything, because business required planning. Long-term planning, risk management, asset protection, structures designed to survive economic downturns, lawsuits, market shifts, and unexpected events. The same principles that protected a company often protected the people who built it. Rachel never paid attention to those conversations. Financial meetings bored her. Legal structures bored her. Contracts bored her. Numbers interested her. Results interested her. Outcomes interested her. Michael finally lifted his eyes from the documents and folded his hands together. Across the table, Rachel looked completely confident. She believed she understood the game because she could see the scoreboard. What she never understood was that the scoreboard only shows the result. It never reveals who wrote the rules. There was a time when I would have done anything for Rachel. Sitting across from her now, it was hard to reconcile that memory with the woman staring at her phone while attorneys discussed the end of our marriage. The distance between those two versions of her felt larger than the 16 floors separating us from the street below. I remembered our first apartment, 600 square feet, a refrigerator that rattled all night, a window unit that struggled every August against the Texas heat. We were happy there, not because life was easy, because we believed we were building something together. Rachel used to leave handwritten notes in my lunch bag before long workdays. Nothing dramatic, just simple reminders. Good luck today. I am proud of you. Do not work too hard. I kept some of those notes for years. Back then, success looked different. Success was making rent, paying off a credit card, replacing worn-out tires before winter. We celebrated small victories because small victories were all we had. When the business started growing, I thought our lives were growing with it. For a while they were. We bought our first house, then a larger one several years later. We traveled occasionally, took vacations we could never have imagined when we were younger. Friends would tell us how lucky we were. I believed them. Looking back, I realized luck had very little to do with it. Came from sacrifice, long hours, missed weekends, endless risk, the kind of work nobody notices once the results arrive. Rachel enjoyed the results. Anyone would have. But gradually, appreciation turned into expectation. The things that once felt special became normal. The things that once felt normal became disappointments. I remember one evening about 7 years ago. We were attending a charity event downtown. I had spent the entire day visiting distribution centers and arrived late, still exhausted from work. During dinner, someone asked how the company was doing. Before I could answer, Rachel smiled and began listing accomplishments, contracts, and revenue figures. Listening to her speak felt strange. She talked about the company like it was an investment portfolio rather than something built through years of uncertainty. Later that night, I asked if everything was okay. She laughed and said I worried too much. Maybe I should have listened to my instincts. Maybe not. Marriage teaches you to overlook small warning signs because nobody wants to believe the foundation is shifting beneath them. Over time, those signs became harder to ignore. Compliments disappeared. Criticism arrived more frequently. Comparisons followed shortly after. Someone else's husband earned more. Someone else's husband traveled more. Someone else's husband seemed more ambitious. The irony was almost funny. I had spent 2 decades building a future for us, yet somehow I was being measured against men who had never carried our responsibilities. Still, I remained quiet, not because I agreed, because arguing rarely changes how someone sees you. The conference room door opened briefly as an assistant delivered fresh coffee. The smell drifted across the table before the door closed again. Rachel barely looked up. Her attention remained fixed on the papers she believed would secure her future. Watching her now, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not bitterness, just sadness. Because the woman I once loved had become so focused on what she thought she was about to gain that she never stopped to consider what she had already lost. The first time I realized something had changed was not during an argument. It was not during a holiday. It was not even during one of the difficult years when the company nearly ran out of cash. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Rachel was standing in the kitchen scrolling through her phone while I poured coffee. Sunlight spilled across the granite countertops. The house was quiet, comfortable, familiar. Then she asked a question that caught me off guard. What would happen to the company if something happened to you? The question itself was not unusual. The way she asked it was. There was no concern in her voice, no curiosity, just calculation. I remember setting my coffee mug down and giving a simple answer about succession planning and executive leadership. She nodded and immediately asked another question. Then another. Then another. Ownership percentages, corporate structure, investment vehicles, future valuations. At the time I told myself she was simply becoming more interested in our finances. Looking back, I can see the pattern much more clearly. The questions never centered on the work. They centered on the assets, the numbers, the outcomes. Over the following years, similar conversations appeared more frequently. Rachel wanted updates on investment performance. She wanted details about acquisitions. She wanted projections. Whenever I discussed operational challenges or employee concerns, her attention faded. But mention growth percentages and suddenly she was engaged again. It was subtle enough that most people would have missed it. I almost did. The company continued expanding. New contracts arrived. New facilities opened. Revenue increased. From the outside, life looked successful. Inside our marriage, something else was growing. A quiet scorecard. At least that is how it felt. Achievements became expectations. Expectations became requirements. I remember one evening after returning from a 3-day business trip. I walked through the front door exhausted but satisfied. We had finalized a major partnership that would secure hundreds of jobs across several states. I expected Rachel to be excited. Instead, her first question was simple. How much is it worth? Not congratulations. Not how are you doing. Just a number. I gave her one. She nodded and returned to her phone. That moment stayed with me longer than it should have. Not because of what she said. Because of what she did not say. Around the same time, I started noticing another change. Rachel increasingly surrounded herself with people who measured success publicly. Bigger houses, new luxury vehicles, exclusive memberships, expensive vacations posted online for strangers to admire. After social gatherings, she would often compare lives, compare achievements, compare appearances, compare net worth. It was exhausting. The woman who once celebrated paying off a credit card now seemed impossible to impress. Through all of it, I remained quiet. I focused on work, focused on stability, focused on protecting what we had built. Not because I expected the marriage to fail, because responsible planning is what leaders do. You prepare for problems before they arrive. Across the conference room table, Rachel adjusted the sleeve of her designer jacket and glanced impatiently toward Michael. She still looked completely certain, completely comfortable, completely convinced that every question she had asked over the years had given her a complete picture. The truth was much simpler. She had spent years studying the value of the company while ignoring the structure beneath it. And sometimes the foundation matters far more than the building standing on top of it. The decision that changed everything did not happen in a courtroom. It did not happen during an argument. It happened on a quiet Thursday afternoon nearly 3 years before the divorce papers ever appeared. I was sitting in a conference room at company headquarters reviewing long-term expansion plans when one of our legal advisors raised a simple question. Have you updated your asset protection structure recently? At the time, the question had nothing to do with Rachel. Nothing to do with marriage. Nothing to do with divorce. It was business. Purely business. The company had reached a size where responsible planning was no longer optional. We had employees depending on us, contracts spanning multiple states, investments tied to future growth. Any experienced business owner understands that success creates exposure. Exposure creates risk, and risk requires preparation. So I listened. Over the next several months, I met with attorneys, accountants, financial planners, and corporate advisors. We reviewed everything: ownership structures, trust arrangements, succession plans, voting rights, liability protection. The process was not exciting. Most people would have found it painfully boring. Rachel certainly would have. That was the difference between us. I had spent years learning that what protects a business is rarely visible from the outside. The strongest foundations are usually the ones nobody notices. Piece by piece, we updated the framework supporting everything I had built. Not to hide assets, not to deceive anyone, to protect them. The same way a homeowner buys insurance before a storm arrives. You do not wait until disaster appears on the horizon. You prepare while the sky is still clear. During those meetings, Michael Harrison became one of my most trusted advisors. He had a habit of asking questions that seemed insignificant until months later when their importance became obvious. One afternoon, he leaned back in his chair and asked, "Who understands the details of these structures besides you?" I thought about it for a moment. The answer was simple. Almost nobody. Not because I was secretive. Because most people simply were not interested. Rachel certainly was not. Whenever legal discussions came up at home, she would lose interest within minutes. She preferred outcomes over process, results over structure, numbers over foundations. At the time, that seemed harmless. Looking back, it explained everything. The irony was almost impossible to ignore. Rachel spent years studying account balances while ignoring the documents that determined how those accounts functioned. She paid attention to valuation reports while overlooking ownership frameworks. She focused on what things were worth instead of understanding how they were protected. Across the conference table now, I watched her glance impatiently toward the clock. She wanted closure. She wanted signatures. She wanted the future she believed was waiting on the other side of this meeting. Michael opened another page and calmly adjusted his glasses. Rachel barely looked at the document. To her, it seemed insignificant. Just another piece of paperwork among hundreds. But I knew better, because sometimes a single document matters more than an entire stack of financial statements. Sometimes one decision made years earlier quietly waits in the background until the exact moment it becomes impossible to ignore. And judging by the confidence still written across Rachel's face, she had absolutely no idea that moment had finally arrived. The room felt different now. Not dramatically, not enough for an outsider to notice, but I could feel it. The air seemed tighter somehow. The casual confidence that had filled the conference room earlier was beginning to thin. Michael placed the document on the table and slid it forward with the same calm precision he had shown throughout the meeting. No theatrics, no speeches, just quiet confidence. Rachel glanced at the paper for less than a second before looking away. That small reaction told me everything. She still believed the important information was somewhere else. Somewhere buried inside the valuation reports and financial summaries spread across the table. Her attorney leaned forward and adjusted his glasses. Unlike Rachel, he actually read the document. His eyes moved slowly across the page. Then he read it again. The change was subtle. A slight tightening around the jaw. A brief pause before turning to the next page. The kind of reaction most people would miss. Michael noticed it immediately. So did I. Rachel did not. She sat back comfortably, crossing one leg over the other. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, clouds drifted across the Dallas skyline. Sunlight faded behind the glass towers across the street, casting long shadows over the conference room table. The polished wood reflected every document, every coffee cup, every expression. For the first time all afternoon, Rachel's attorney stopped speaking. Silence settled over the room. It lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Rachel finally looked toward him. "Is there a problem?" she asked. Her tone carried mild annoyance rather than concern. She expected reassurance. She expected him to dismiss whatever Michael had presented. Instead, he continued reading. That was when I saw the first crack appear. Not panic, not fear, confusion. People become uncomfortable when reality refuses to follow the script they already wrote in their minds. Rachel had spent months imagining this day. She knew exactly how she thought it would unfold. Every conversation, every negotiation, every outcome. What she had never considered was the possibility that she was missing information. Michael folded his hands together. Calm, patient, unmoved. The clock on the wall continued its steady rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Nobody spoke. Rachel's attorney finally placed the document back on the table. He looked toward Michael, then toward me, then back to the paperwork again. "When was this established?" he asked carefully. Michael answered without hesitation. "Nearly 3 years ago." Another silence followed, this one heavier than the first. Rachel sat forward now. Her confidence remained, but something else had joined it. Curiosity, the kind that appears when certainty begins slipping away. "Established what?" she asked. Neither attorney answered immediately. Michael simply opened another supporting document and placed it beside the first one. Rachel stared at the pages, waiting for someone to explain. Watching her in that moment reminded me of something I learned years ago in business. Most major changes happen long before anyone notices them. By the time people recognize the shift, the important decisions have already been made. Rachel was finally starting to realize there was another layer beneath everything she thought she understood. And as Michael prepared to explain that layer, the confidence she had carried into the room was beginning to disappear, one unanswered question at a time. Rachel looked from Michael to her attorney and back again. The confidence that had carried her through the entire afternoon was no longer effortless. She was still composed, still determined, but the certainty was fading. Questions have a way of doing that, especially when nobody is rushing to answer them. Michael finally broke the silence. His voice remained calm and professional. "The structure was established nearly 3 years ago and has been fully operational since that time." Rachel frowned. "What structure?" she asked again. This time Michael slid the primary document directly across the table. Her attorney did not stop him. That detail alone caught her attention. Slowly, she picked up the pages and began reading. I watched her eyes move from line to line. At first there was nothing, then confusion, then concentration. The room seemed unusually quiet. Even the sounds of the city outside felt distant. For several seconds nobody moved. Rachel turned another page, then another. Her expression tightened. "I do not understand," she said. Michael nodded. "That is why we are here." He opened a supporting document and placed it beside the first. The ownership structure governing the majority of the business interests and associated holdings was reorganized years ago. Control rights, voting authority, management authority, and beneficiary designations were formally established at that time. Rachel stared at him. "And what exactly does that mean?" Her attorney cleared his throat before Michael could answer. It was the first time all afternoon that he sounded uncertain. "It means the assets you believed were directly held are not structured the way you assumed." Rachel turned toward him immediately. "What are you talking about?" He pointed to a section of the document. "Read the designated controlling beneficiary provision." Her eyes dropped back to the page. The silence returned, long enough for the ticking clock to become noticeable again. Then she reached the line. I saw the exact moment it happened. Her eyes stopped moving. Her shoulders became rigid. The confidence vanished. Not dramatically, just suddenly, like a light switching off in a room. She read the line again, then a third time. The name listed first under the controlling beneficiary designation was mine. Ethan Walker. The same name appeared again under management authority, again under voting control, again under succession authority. Years of planning, years of legal work, years of structure, all sitting quietly inside documents she had never bothered to examine. Rachel looked up slowly. "This cannot be right." Her voice was softer now. Not angry, not confident, just shocked. Michael remained composed. "It is entirely correct." Her attorney offered no disagreement. That was the moment everything changed. Not because anyone raised their voice. Not because anyone celebrated. Because reality had finally entered the room. Rachel had spent months preparing for a division of assets she believed she fully understood. But the framework beneath those assets told a very different story. She looked at me for the first time that afternoon without certainty in her eyes. And as the silence settled over the conference room once more, I realized something. The woman who thought she knew every detail of my success had just discovered how little she actually understood about the man she spent 20 years underestimating. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Rachel continued staring at the documents as though reading them again might somehow change what was written on the page. Her attorney quietly reviewed the paperwork one final time before setting it down. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was gone. In its place sat something much heavier. Reality. Michael closed his folder and leaned back in his chair. His work was finished. The facts had spoken for themselves. That was always his style. No grand speeches. No dramatic victories. Just preparation meeting the moment it was designed for. I looked across the table at Rachel and felt something I never expected to feel. Not satisfaction. Not revenge. Certainly not happiness. Just acceptance. 22 years is a long time to share a life with someone. Long enough to build memories into the walls of a house. Long enough to forget where your story ends and theirs begins. Yet somehow we had arrived here. Two people sitting across from each other like strangers reviewing the final chapter of a book neither of us expected to finish this way. Rachel finally lifted her eyes. The fight was gone from her expression. So was the certainty. "Why did you never tell me?" she asked quietly. The question hung in the air between us. I thought about it for a moment before answering. "Because you never asked about the foundation," I said. "You only asked about the numbers." The room fell silent again. Outside the windows, the late afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent across the Dallas skyline. The glass towers glowed with gold reflections. Traffic crawled through the streets below. Life continued moving forward, completely unaware that mine had just changed forever. Rachel lowered her gaze. For the first time all afternoon, she seemed less focused on the documents and more focused on the years behind them. The years we spent building something together. The years neither of us could get back. Michael gathered the remaining paperwork and stood. Rachel's attorney followed a moment later. Practical discussions still remained. Signatures, timelines, formalities. But the outcome was no longer the outcome Rachel had imagined. The meeting ended without raised voices. Without celebration. Without anyone storming out of the room. That felt appropriate somehow. The most important moments in my life had rarely been loud. Building a company was not loud. Earning trust was not loud. Protecting what mattered was not loud. Why should this be any different? I stood and buttoned my jacket. For a brief second, Rachel looked like she wanted to say something else. Maybe an apology. Maybe a question. Maybe nothing at all. In the end, neither of us spoke. Some conversations arrived too late to change anything. I shook Michael's hand, thanked him for his work, and walked toward the conference room door. The polished floor reflected the fading sunlight. Each step felt lighter than the one before it. Not because I had won, because I no longer needed to prove anything. As the elevator doors closed and the city descended beneath me floor by floor, I thought about the words Rachel had spoken at the beginning of the day. Those words no longer carried any weight. People often believe their greatest mistakes are the relationships they leave behind. I think the greater mistake is failing to recognize the value of someone while they are still standing beside you. By the time you finally understand their worth, the opportunity to appreciate it may already be gone. And somewhere between the 16th floor and the lobby, I realized the future waiting for me was not defined by what I kept or what I lost. It was defined by what I learned. The chapter was over. The lesson would stay with me forever.